So hello and welcome to today's Centre for European Legal Studies seminar. And we're really thrilled to be able to welcome today Professor Colin Scott from University College Dublin to give today's seminar. Colin will be well known to many of you. He's Professor of EU Regulation and Governance at UCD. In other guises, he is Principal of the College of Social Sciences and Law and Dean for Social Sciences. Colin's reputation is he's incredibly well known for the work that he does on regulatory policy. I think almost everything I know about regulatory theory, regulatory policy, regulatory spaces is largely due to Colin. So Colin, it is a great honour for us to have you, and thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. And Colin's going to talk for about half an hour about the emerging regulatory landscape for digital services and how we should begin to think and conceptualise a regulatory toolkit for carrying out that task. So without any further comment from me, Colin, great to have you.
Thanks very much, Kenneth. It's really delightful to be with you virtually today, and I hope in person in future. And it's a privilege to be able to talk in this wonderful seminar series. I'm just going to talk for a moment about the motivation for the paper, and then I've got some slides which I'll share. So the presentation today is very much a work in progress. The paper looks at the potential for deploying a regulatory toolkit approach to better understand proposed and potential mechanisms for addressing the policy challenges associated with the digital society. The paper is motivated by a dissatisfaction at the way regulation is discussed, particularly in current EU policymaking. Big tech firms, for example, often present their position as a willingness to comply with whatever regulation national or EU authorities may impose. But in my view, this is misleading as first, big tech companies possess substantial regulatory capacity themselves, for example, through their terms of service and supply chain contracts. And second, because they are also key actors in making regulatory policy in their dialogue with both EU and national authorities. This is not to say that national and EU regulators and policymakers fail to recognize the dispersal of regulatory capacity, but rather it is just frequently the case that discussions falls back to a rather monochrome model of state regulation and enforcement. What I'm talking about today, a toolkit approach, looks to the widest possible range of instruments and actors and recognizes that regulatory space is not empty before state regulation, but rather that regulation occurs through alternative actors and instruments in the absence of the state, and regulating is a matter of working with the grain of the range of mechanisms, both state and non-state, and range of actors who are involved in any particular regulatory space, in this case relating to the digital society. So following that brief sort of introduction about motivation, I will now, if you bear with me a moment, I will share my slides. So what I want to talk about now is, in the presentation, is in this outline here. First, I want to say a little bit about the nature of digital society and why it raises policy challenges for us, some of which are new, others of which are old challenges presented in new ways. I'll secondly talk a bit about the emergent models of regulation in response to the challenge of the digital society, with a particular focus on the EU. I'll then outline a range of possible ways of thinking about how a regulatory toolkit might be developed, what it might look like. And then a principal focus will be on how a regulatory toolkit might be deployed in the digital policy area. And I'll conclude with something about potential research and policy implications. So I'm going to start just with a recent news story that was published in the Irish Times, an article by a well-known activist, Johnny Ryan, with the headline, Ireland blew its chance to be super enforcer for online content across EU. I'm highlighting this story because it demonstrates some of the key themes that I want to address today. So in this article, Johnny Ryan correctly says that there's been a good deal of controversy about the way that the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, has been enforced. He presents GDPR, which was adopted in 2016 and implemented with a date in 2018. He presents it as a model in some ways for the future of regulation across a wide range of areas in the digital society. And a key part of the model was national regulators would regulate the tech firms, or all the firms within the large firms within their country. So Ireland became a key regulator, and the Data Protection Commission in Ireland became a key regulator for the whole EU with respect to tech firms that have their European headquarters in Ireland. And he argues in the article that the Data Protection Commissioner has been insufficiently stringent about their enforcement, with a result that in the next stages of regulation in the EU, referring in particular to the Digital Services Act, a political agreement on which was reached last month, referring particularly to that, a different model is being chosen in which the EU, in particular the Commission, has much stronger enforcement role than is the case with GDPR. Now, I don't think anything is so wrong about what Johnny Ryan argues in saying that a more centralized EU model is being adopted because of concerns about weaknesses at the national level. But it also seems to me the picture is incomplete, in part because even with GDPR, whilst national enforcement has been a key part of GDPR, there has also been a massive cultural change in organizations, public and private, stimulated by GDPR, with a much greater focus on internal monitoring and reporting and compliance through the Office of Data Protection Officers within firms required by GDPR. And it seems to me that GDPR represents a mixed model of regulation, not a single state enforcement model, and that actually the DPO innovation has been a very significant part of the cultural change. We want to understand the weaknesses and strengths and successes and failures of GDPR. We must look internally at the culture of how firms regulate themselves, indeed how public bodies regulate themselves with respect to data privacy. And what is it that promotes compliance with GDPR? Is it the threat of enforcement, or is it having effective internal compliance mechanisms, or perhaps a mixture of the two? So this article, as I say, sets up very nicely my theme, because I think it has an excessive focus on state regulation and the shift to, in the Digital Services Act, the shift to European Commission-based monitoring and enforcement, whereas in my view, we should be looking at the wider toolkit. And I'll say something about the mix of mechanisms being anticipated within the new package of legislation in a few moments. So coming back to the beginning, having illustrated something of the regulatory challenge, I want to say something a little bit about digital society and the policy challenges it raises. I'm not going to cover this very fully, partly because we would be here all day if we looked very thoroughly at the digital society and its policy challenges. Just a bit of a thumbnail sketch is what I will present. So I remember back in the days of the early 90s, the huge excitement around digitization and all the things that we could achieve once we could deliver much larger amounts of data down both the old technology of copper wire and phone lines, but also the new and emerging technology of fiber optic cables. And so digitization was very exciting, and was accompanied by, because the invention of the World Wide Web in the period 1992-1993, which again I remember seeing the initial web browser Cello, developed by the Legal Information Institute in Cornell, and going to the website, as I discovered it was called, of the US Supreme Court, seeing a photo of the justices, and being able to download judgments from the court. I'd emphasize I could only download that at that time judgments had actually been delivered. Draft samostat copies of judgments weren't available on that website. I think still aren't available on that website, but only through Politico. But in any case, the digitization of judgments and photos and their delivery down the World Wide Web immediately seemed to me to be an absolute revolution for information management and sharing and access. And I didn't even think at that stage of all the commercial implications and indeed the wider societal implications of digitization. So digitization leads then to a digital economy and so many different things that we do now online, largely through World Wide Web, but not exclusively through World Wide Web. Cable TV, for example, provides another example of quite a revolution and sharing of broadcast and other content resources. And the way that digital technology become embedded in our lives through social media and other mechanisms in the workplace as well, and for our holidays, leads us to think about something even more, where digital is even more embedded, something we might call the digital society. And whilst the digital society clearly has many things to commend it as ways of enhancing our lives and what we can do and what can we achieve and how we can fulfill ourselves. And that is a reason that from a policy perspective, digital society is very strongly supported. And indeed, the EU has a policy priority to establish a degree of technological sovereignty in respect of this space. Nevertheless, it raises many challenges. And the digital policy problem set includes a whole range of matters relating to consumer value, AI, and a lot of algorithmic decision-making, the implications of platformizing both our economy and our society through interactive services of a wide range of kinds, problems of distrust, problems of data privacy. And I've got a long list here, which I'm not going to go through in detail. And each of these policy problems has policy of people working on them, people, of course, industry and NGOs engaging with them, academics commenting and reviewing. And I think one of the key challenges in my area of interest in regulatory policy is there are so many policy actions ongoing simultaneously addressing such a wide range of problems. It's actually difficult for anyone to get an overall perspective on what regulation for the digital society looks like. And indeed, having started on that task during a period of leave during the first 3 months of this year, I realized I may have been a bit mad to start out with the ambition of looking at regulatory governance for digital society overall, because the range of policy areas, challenges, and indeed instruments that one needs to look at to get a handle on what is happening is very wide indeed. But there we go. I've started, so I'll finish, as they used to say in the world of university challenge. Alongside my listing, I've also showing here the World Economic Forum diagram, which splits up the different challenges into 6 different sets: data standards, industry practices, assessing impact implications, ethics, values, and norms, the business and economy of data, and laws and regulation. I find this helpful analytically, but it doesn't fully show, I think, how these 6 different sets of issues are joined up. And of course, there's subsets of all these issues that are around the outside that you probably won't be able to read today, but you can follow up with the World Economic Forum if you are interested in that. So there's a lot of interest, I think, in how we think about all the different policy challenges arising from the digital society. As I mentioned, there are strong policy reasons to support the development of the digital society. But then beyond that, when we think about the problems, should we be thinking about particular sectors and issues, or should we think about behaviors and values, and or should we think about the interplay between them? And should we be thinking just about problems of markets, or should we simultaneously be thinking not only about digital policy in markets, but also digital policy for society, and also digital policy for governance, because clearly digitalization is very strongly affecting governance today, through not just through algorithmic decision making and AI, but also through other mechanisms for enhancing ways that we engage democracy, ways that we deliver and engage over administrative decision making and so on. So many policy challenges in the digital society that I'm not going to outline in more detail now. Thinking about the EU regulatory response, there's at least a dozen different areas of policy activity which are currently being prioritized within the EU, addressing different aspects of the digital society. As I mentioned, the Digital Services Act was subject of political agreement in the EU last month. The Digital Markets Act, which in some ways is a partner piece of legislation, acting in tandem with Digital Services Act, more on the competition side and the leveling playing field side, that was subject to political agreement in March. So there is definitely a moment currently of really moving forward digital society policies for regulation on a quite a range of fronts. Looking over all the different areas of current activity, I could say a couple of things about the models that are emerging. The first is that, as with other areas of EU law and policy, there's quite a high degree of path dependence for what I call state-centered regulatory approaches, which deploy law and hierarchy, and some intensification of regulatory oversight, especially at the EU level. And in some ways, we can see this as following the trend in the financial services area that followed the financial crises of 2008 onwards and led to the establishment of new and more powerful regulatory agencies, and indeed a stronger role for the central bank, European Central Bank, in regulation of financial markets. Key aspects of this trend include moving from sort of network approaches to in the EU to more agentified or agency approaches. Examples in the communications area include BEREC, in respect to data privacy of the European Data Protection Board, and in the draft Digital Services Act, there's proposed a board for digital services, and the draft AI Act, there is a proposed European AI board. And I think there's no doubt that they will become more agentified over time and fora for substantive decision making about the implementation of regulatory rules. The second feature, as I mentioned, is enhanced EU supervision, notably through the European Commission, both in the draft Digital Services Act and in the draft Digital Markets Act. Of course, a standard instrument within such legal regulation is to prohibit activities which are defined as illegal, and that's one of the features of the Digital Services Act. There is a role for national regulatory authorities. So Digital Services Coordinator is a mandatory requirement for member states within the Digital Services Act, and anticipated that, like the European Commission, there may be a form of pyramidal enforcement with the capacity for education advice at the base of a pyramid, through which there will be an ascent towards more stringent penalties, including fines and, well, possibly in some jurisdictions, imprisonment as well. And then a novel feature within both the DSA and the DMA is an approach based on asymmetric regulation and proportionality, under which the larger tech companies, very large online platforms, online search, very large online search engines, those with more than 10% market share in the EU, will be subject to more direct and stringent regulation and also risk analysis through the European Commission. So that's a very interesting innovation. But overall, these trends tend to support the view of movement towards a more hierarchical, law-based, and indeed EU-centric based approach to tackling some of the problems. But that is not the whole story, because there's plenty in the Digital Services Act to indicate alternative approaches to regulation being embedded within the new regime. So I'll highlight a few of those here. First, there's a commitment within the DSA towards developing standards and codes to support norms for the sector. through industry and civil society dialogue. And that, I think, the detail of that as we see it emerge, I think will be very interesting for finding ways to tackle changing and novel issues around the effects of digitization on society. Second, there is very importantly a recognition of the importance of firms in compliance. So in the Digital Markets Act, the very large firms are, very large intermediary firms are described as gatekeepers with a whole range of responsibilities placed on them as a result of that, recognizing their role essentially in regulating who and how people have access to major platforms. And in the Digital Services Act, there's a recognition of the important role that the very large firms play in content moderation and requirements around due diligence and transparency with respect to their algorithms. And a lot of that is focused really on the firms and how they set themselves up to behave and use their powers with respect in particular to those who use their platforms. And as I mentioned earlier in respect to GDPR, there's of course the data protection officer, who is a very important part of the internal compliance mechanisms within firms. This is something that all firms and indeed public bodies are used to having an internal compliance function, in this case with respect to data privacy. There are then responsibilities of industry self-reporting on compliance, non-compliance. We saw those in GDPR. They actually exist also in respect of earlier regimes around product safety and are a key part of the Digital Services Act. Digital Services Act also requires, for the very large online platform providers, third-party audit of their compliance. So this is a sort of privatization of monitoring for compliance. That means that the firms themselves will bear the cost, and the assurance comes through the reliability and independence of third-party auditors. Of course, that raises questions. We know that third-party audit hasn't always been successful in providing the assurance it's supposed to provide. We think back to Enron, for example. So that raises some important questions about how to ensure that that third-party audit is credible. And then there are mechanisms for empowering citizens through private liability, complaints and ADR systems, and also recognition of trusted flaggers, people who take on a monitoring role privately, and firms are required to take particular notice of their requests around monitoring and taking down content in breach of the rules, which I think is, again, very interesting diversification of recognition of capacity for oversight and monitoring within the regime. So, in summary, there is a strong indication of more centralization, emphasizing law and hierarchy within the emerging EU regime for regulation in the digital space. But there's also a significant amount of development instruments and roles for actors that suggest a more diffuse approach. But as the newspaper article I quoted at the beginning suggests, and indeed the tech firms suggest, we often think in a simple language of the state regulating more through rules. And a toolkit approach has, I think, the merit of laying bare the very wide range of mechanisms that can be used either in isolation or perhaps complementary with each other to achieve particular regulatory objectives. So a toolkit approach moves us beyond a state-centric regulatory state model to what's sometimes called regulatory capitalism. It involves a range of actors and instruments, not just state legislation, but also, for example, supply chain contracts as mechanisms of regulation. And we might today even think of regulatory society, in which we match the ubiquity of policy challenges with an ubiquity of regulatory actions, and see that in the digital space, nearly every action can have itself a regulatory dimension. The things we do as citizens on websites with crowdfunding of responses and feedback, that has a regulatory effect through a sort of aggregated market mechanism. So we all, in a sense, have a regulatory role through our behaviors within the digital space. And so a regulatory society is perhaps a way we might be thinking in the future. I suggest a toolkit approach offers some potential to think rather more broadly about actors and norms, to recognize first regulatory space is not empty, even prior to state regulation. Market actors, NGOs, have various means to develop and implement norms, and non-state actors are also significant in monitoring and enforcement. In the old usage, the term of gatekeepers, for example, banks have been a key regulator around internet gambling through their control via the credit card mechanism. Methods of regulatory steering are not limited to law and hierarchy, and if we recognize that regulatory power is dispersed, as say a form of what Clifford Shearing and colleagues talk about as nodal governance, then it's challenging to imagine any one policy actor having overall control of regulation. That is an issue I want to explore further with the way the European Commission is thinking. Do the European Commission think that the EU can set all the norms and objectives around the digital space, or is it the case that that will be dispersed, for example, through some of the work around codes and standards? And the final thing I say about this is that using a toolkit approach is not inconsistent with the EU's own approach. The European Commission Better Regulation Guidance and Toolbox are in the latest edition, November 2021. But I think that toolbox approach is not being so strongly applied, consistently applied across all policy areas, including the digital area. So think about a digital policy toolkit. The approach searches for regulatory capacity wherever it may lie, with government, in some cases, of course, with regulation, laws and enforcement, with firms, as I've mentioned earlier, with associations of firms, and also with NGOs, and indeed sometimes with citizens, seeks to match instruments responsively to the environment, to look for not only, some people advocate non-state approaches because they're less costly, but I think the argument for non-state approaches to regulation is more about effectiveness and going with the grain of the particular sector. So looking at toolkit approaches, I've worked with a few different ones over my career. First, the resources-based approach that Christopher Hood set down with his the acronym of NATO, in which he says that the entire set of tools for governing can be summarized as consisting of, on their own or in combination, 4 different resource bases. First, nodality, which is about the capacity to collect and to give out information. So using the position of government at the center of information to steer behaviors. A second is authority. That's law and hierarchy, the making of rules, enforcement of rules. Third is treasure, which is about finance, the ability to collect taxes and then to spend money in order to deliver public policy options. And then the fourth is organization, the capacity through the employment and activities of public servants to get things done. And each of these, Hood suggests, is important to delivering on public policy in different mixes. The well-known approach by Lawrence Lessig uses more of a social organization approach. And I use a number of different synonyms here to capture the 4 different modes that Lessig talks about in his very important work, Code, and Code 2.0. So some regulation is through community, network, social norms. Some regulation is through hierarchy, law, command, or oversight. Some is through markets, competition, and rivalry. And some is through a fourth contested mode that might be referred to as architecture, might be referred to as design, or indeed contrived randomness. But each of these 4 social organization approaches is distinct, but many ways of regulating actually comprise considerable overlap between these. My preliminary thinking is that I would, in my work here, actually use the EU regulatory toolbox as the basis, because the EU regulatory toolbox is already in play within the EU, has legitimacy as an EU way of thinking about how to be effective around regulation. So the EU regulatory toolbox emphasizes education and information, first, then the option of using hard, legally binding rules. Third, the use of economic instruments. And fourth, a rather large catch-all category that includes soft regulation, recommendations, the open method of coordination, self and co-regulation, and also technical standards. So I have there's some challenges for me around the way that the EU regulatory toolbox is articulated. There are also some challenges about the consistency with which it is applied. But my intention in this work as it develops is to look more systematically at the way the toolbox has been applied and could be applied to think broadly about different approaches to regulation within the digital space. So just to briefly outline the deployment of the regulatory toolkit in EU digital policy, I've taken here an adapted version of a policy cycle with 5 different stages in regulatory policy. And we'll just briefly outline the range of choices, a preliminary view of the range of choices available at each of the 5 stages using a toolkit approach. So starting at the beginning of the policy cycle with what I call policy reflection around what should be the objectives and the instruments, there's a range of tools here, some of which are already very much in play. Regulatory impact analysis, for example, is in play both nationally and at EU level. The regulatory toolbox, which is supposed to consider a very wide range of alternatives to command and control regulation. In practice, my sense is the toolbox is deployed quite late, and law-based regulation is very frequently the outcome without proper consideration of other alternatives. The EU since 2015 has emphasized enhanced consultation over policy. There is an option to think about meta-regulation, which is the idea that there's already a regulation going on in a space before we engage state regulation. One option would be to monitor what goes on in the space and maybe seek reports about what's happening. And if the reports are satisfactory, then observe and leave it to get on with itself. But if there are obvious opportunities to steer towards better solutions, then to require, without necessarily specifying what, you require some changes that better meet the objectives through a meta-regulatory approach, sometimes referred to as the regulation of self-regulation. There's been a good deal of experimentation in the fintech area internationally with the idea of a regulatory sandbox, the idea that you permit firms a space where they can experiment with new approaches and new norms prior to the development of a fuller, wider application of norms to those particular problems. And then in the work of Chuck Sable and Jonathan Zeitlin and others, there's a considerable emphasis on using methods of deliberation and experimentation to learn better through, and then have a process of iteration to learn better about what priorities should be and how they can be addressed in the policy framework. Turning to the norms and or standard setting within the digital policy space, there's a core choice between rules and principles, which isn't a very clear choice because there's some overlap between rules and principles, but this has been much discussed in the context of financial regulation. There's a potential, as the EU Better Regulation Toolkit makes, to use guidance or soft law as a way of steering behaviours without resorting to so-called hard law. The Digital Services Act, as I mentioned, gives considerable emphasis to the development of codes of conduct as a mechanism for engaging deliberation to develop norms through dialogue. We know that private technical standards are very widely used and then implemented through supply chain contracts in digital and other policy spaces. Many of the big tech firms use their terms of service to regulate their users. And for many of the evils which digital regulation is designed to address, terms of service quite properly provide a first port of call for regulating the behaviors of those whose behaviors breach the societal norms. And then there's also something about market community expectations, sometimes referred to as the social license to operate. We've seen over past years, following the Cambridge Analytica scandal, there was a market response from users of Facebook, some of whom deleted their accounts. And we've seen very recently in the proposal for Elon Musk to take over ownership of Twitter, we've also seen people leaving Twitter in response, indicating voting with their feet to indicate what may or may not be acceptable to the user community as a means of steering the behavior of the firms. Coming on to the third part of the cycle, the feedback and monitoring aspect of regulation. I've mentioned already the importance of self-reporting within both GDPR and the draft Digital Services Act. Audit, but also third-party audit and certification is also significant. Traditionally in regulation, the hierarchical method, of course, is one of inspection, and that's not unimportant, but moving broadly out to the role of consumers and citizens, crowdsourcing through online reviews has become an increasingly important way of regulating through aggregation in the marketplace of quality, for example, with respect to hotels and online retail. I've mentioned already supply chain contracts, which provide mechanisms for monitoring not only compliance with core norms around price and quality, but also for monitoring compliance with codes of practice and other third-party norms that may be incorporated into supply chain contracts. And then I mentioned also already the gatekeepers as monitors, both the role of platforms, monitoring through their terms of service and through feedback, and indeed the role of banks and other third parties who may have capacity to engage in monitoring through their role. And then there is this prospect of algorithmic oversight, automated ways of overseeing behaviors and triggering responses then. Think about how behaviors are corrected, modification of behavior. The traditional mode is through responsive enforcement and the application of sanctions, of course. In supply chain contracts, we might have contractual sanctions. I've talked earlier about compliance officers in GDPR and also within the DSA. The EU has made a lot of using enforcement networks as a mode of learning across different countries, different regulators, as to how to think about and address particular challenges. There's a range of economic instruments that are quite well developed in some areas, not only taxes and subsidies, but also fines and loans. I've mentioned earlier the DSA proposals around liability rules and alternative dispute resolution. Very strong emerging literature suggesting smart contracts will provide a mechanism for direct enforcement of not only substantive contractual norms, but also regulatory norms. This is referred to by some as the promise of Web 3.0, and in Roger Brownsword's work in the book of that name, the promise of Law 3.0 that combines technological ways of correcting behaviors alongside legal mechanisms and looks at interplay between the two. And then there are behavioral measures, one of which would be to encourage stronger digital literacy and responsibility amongst consumers and citizens for what they do, which of course is criticized by some as being somewhat neoliberal in approach, but I think there probably is a responsibility for users of digital platforms to take some responsibility around their own learning capacity. And then think about review and revision. The fifth part of any policy cycle is to review what's happened and to revise. And there's a range of instruments here for doing that I mentioned here. And I'm not going to go into anything more about at this moment, but in the interest of time. So here's what the deployment of Toolkit might look like in terms of looking at the options at each stage of a regulatory policy cycle. And we can map both existing and proposed new areas of regulation using this tool, and maybe identify gaps in opportunities that are not being taken, or maybe are present but not being discussed, not being highlighted through using a toolkit approach. So I'm going to conclude with just a brief summary, preliminary implications, first for research and second for policy. In terms of research, this approach gives a somewhat, I argue, more realistic recognition of the distribution of power and capacity within the digital policy sphere. It implicates more organizations and actors as playing a role in regulation. But there is a limit to the Toolkit approach because it assumes that there is someone in control who is knowledgeable and competent. The more advanced theoretical literature talks about the search for interpolable balance, defined as the need to determine self-correcting mechanisms that are already present in the system. And an array of other complementary controls can be added, and there may be overlap. But the suggestion is it may be wrong to assume that control is exercised exclusively from a fixed point within the system. In other words, there may be a degree of hubris about EU or indeed national state policymakers and regulators thinking they can control a whole system, where we know from experience in the digital world that behaviors may be unpredictable, and indeed preferences may be unpredictable, such that no one is in control overall. That's a rather terrifying prospect, of course, for policymakers and indeed for legislators, and so it tends to get downplayed. But the Commission has recently talked about an ecosystem of trust, which I think does imply perhaps the idea that there's no one in overall control. And Destrel and Legend, recent work, have talked about an ecosystem of oversight to match that. Concluding then just with some of the policy implications, the Toolkit approach involves the search for best capacity and joining up of capacity, search for best fit of instruments, but it is not about displacing self-regulation with state regulation, or indeed vice versa. And one possible way I can conclude from a policy perspective would be to say that the implications of the Toolkit approach would be to look for areas where we need more hierarchy, so more centralized oversight in EU agencies and national regulators, but also within organizations such as firms. We might need more competition-based instruments, more rivalry over standards or subsidies or taxes as mechanisms for steering behaviors. We might need more community-based instruments, such as engagement over the making and implementation of codes on internet content and the role of NGOs in monitoring behaviors. And we might need more design-based instruments, so behavioral instruments, but also greater consideration of the way that smart contracts and Law 3.0 might change the landscape and how state agencies might respond to a recognition of more of that sort of activity through regulation through design. I'm going to stop there. I've gone on a bit long, but I think Kenneth's going to now join in, and I'll stop sharing.